Okay, so in the world of superhero movies, the relationship between the people who make them and the fans who love them, well, it's gotten pretty intense lately. It feels like it's at a real boiling point, and we're going to dive into why.
You see this question everywhere, right? Why does it seem like fans are so angry with Marvel and DC all of a sudden? We're going to break down the arguments from a really fiery online debate to try and figure out what is actually going on here.
All right, first up, let's take a look at Marvel. A simple casting rumor, not even a confirmation, just the rumor, for one of their most important characters absolutely lit a fire online.
So yeah, this was just an unconfirmed scoop from someone online. But that's all it took. The idea that this actor was in the running immediately sparked this huge, powerful backlash from a very vocal part of the fan base. It really caught a lot of people off guard.
And this right here was at the very heart of that initial anger. The criticism was all about the idea that the actor, because he's biracial, just wasn't dark-skinned enough to play the king of Wakanda, this famously isolationist African nation.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. People who disagreed with the backlash immediately pointed to what they called out as, some major hypocrisy. Their argument was pretty simple. How can you cheer when traditionally white characters get race-swapped, but then turn around and protest when an actor's skin tone for a black character isn't exactly what you had in mind? It just shows you how tense these conversations can get.
As this thing just blew up online, it became pretty clear that the casting rumor was really just the spark that lit the fuse. It tapped into something much deeper, way more sensitive, and frankly, an unresolved issue for the whole Black Panther franchise.
See, for a long time now, a lot of fans have been saying that Marvel made a huge mistake by not recasting T'Challa. The argument is that the character is just bigger than any one actor, and retiring him was a disservice to the legacy. So this new rumor about a potential T'Challa just ripped that old wound right open.
And this really gets to the core of it. For these critics, the sequel, Wakanda Forever, wasn't about honoring an actor. They argue it was about monetizing Chadwick Boseman's death. They saw the movie's focus on his character's funeral not as a tribute, but as this cynical, emotionally manipulative way to sell tickets. And to them, that was just beyond the pale.
So while the whole blow-up at Marvel was about this one super emotional creative choice, the backlash over at DC is aimed at something much bigger, the leadership itself. Let's switch gears and look at DC Studios and its co-head, James Gunn.
The source we're pulling from uses this exact phrase to describe James Gunn. And what they mean is he's constantly, and I mean constantly, engaging with fans and critics on social media. A lot of people feel like that's just not what a studio head should be doing, and that it usually just stirs up more drama than it solves.
So, a perfect example of this happened recently when Gunn went on social media to defend the screenwriter Christina Hodson. And this defense came right after she'd gotten a ton of heat for her work on 2 movies that were, to put it mildly, massive financial disasters for the studio.
And here's what we're talking about in real money. $250 million. That's the estimated loss from films like The Flash and the Batgirl movie that got canceled. So for critics, seeing the head of the studio defending the writer behind those kinds of failures just seemed, well, completely out of touch.
So this was Gunn's defense. He basically said, hey, you haven't even read her scripts, and then he dropped the bomb that she was part of the original brain trust for his new DC universe. But for his critics, that wasn't the flex he thought it was. It just made them even more worried about the DCU's foundation.
Dunn's argument then went a step further, suggesting that, a movie's final quality isn't all on the writer, because a director can change things up a lot. And look, that's a fair point, totally. But it creates a huge contradiction when you look at what he said about one of those movies before it bombed.
Because you remember this, right? Before The Flash came out and was a total disaster, Gunn himself was hyping it up, calling it a masterpiece. He didn't just say the script was good. He said the final film, the one directed by Andy Muschietti, was one of the best he'd ever seen.
And this is exactly what the critics jumped on. I mean, you can't have it both ways. They argue that Gunn is talking out of both sides of his mouth, praising the movie to sell it, then blaming the direction to defend the writer. And that kind of inconsistency just erodes any trust in his leadership.
So according to the source material, this feeling that there's no clear, consistent vision from the top has left the new DC universe in absolute shambles before it's even really gotten off the ground.
I mean, just look at the initial slate of projects they announced with all this hype. The Wonder Woman prequel, Paradise Lost? Dead. Swamp Thing? Looks dead. Other big ones like Brave and the Bold are still years away. This just doesn't look like a healthy, well-oiled machine.
So when you boil it all down, the criticisms of the current leadership really point to a fundamental problem with the whole structure. You've got a CEO who is also the main creative force, which critics say is a huge conflict of interest. There's no one there to say no. It all feeds into this perception that the leadership is just unqualified for the job and that their niche, hipster taste just isn't a good fit for huge mainstream heroes like Superman.
Okay, so we've looked at these two pretty different situations. What's the common thread here? What really connects the fan backlash at Marvel with all the chaos over at DC?
Ultimately, it really all comes down to one thing: trust, or a complete breakdown of it. On one side, you have Marvel being accused of cynically using a real-life tragedy for profit. On the other, you have DC's leadership looking inconsistent and just totally out of its depth. Both cases show this huge gap between the studios and what a big chunk of their audience actually wants to see.
And that leaves us with a really critical question for the future of these pop culture giants. In this high-stakes game of billion-dollar movies, who are the studios actually making these for? Is there still any room for what the fans want, for legacy, or has it all just been boiled down to a cold, hard calculation about what they think will sell? The answer to that is probably going to define the next 10 years of superhero movies.